Hello and welcome to the Avrum Rosensweig Show.
Welcome to one of the internet's best podcasts, where we dive deep into the lives of the extraordinary and fascinating people who leave an indelible mark on our world. Join us as we explore their captivating stories, remarkable achievements, and unique perspectives that shape history and inspire generations. Get ready to embark on a journey through the lives of inspiring people unlike any other.
Hello and welcome to the Avrum Rosensweig Show. My name is Avrum Rosensweig, and I'm very delighted to be here. I'm very happy that you are joining me and my guest today. You who've watched the show before know that the show is all about honoring humankind. It's the idea that we really need to open our eyes and see the beauty that exists on our shared earth. And there is so much of it. And there is so much of it. We have done a magnificent job in 5,000 years or 6 billion years, however you qualify our earth and when it was created, in terms of getting to where we're at today. Now, much of what we have done to enhance our world, our earth, is through spirituality and it's through leadership. Today, I am very, very deeply honored to have as my guest someone whom I've known for a number of years, a very, very kind human being, Maurice Switzer. How are you, Maurice?
Oh, I'm great. Thanks so much, Avrum.
Oh, it's so nice to have you. I just want to tell you, folks, before we dive into the interview, that Maurice Switzer is a citizen of the Mississaugas of Alderville First Nation. He is the principal of Nimke Communications, a public education practice which focuses on the treaty relationship between First Nations and the Canadian government. He served as the director of communication for both Assembly of First Nations and the Union of Ontario Indians. He began as a cub reporter with the Belleville Intelligencer and retired as a publisher of the Winnipeg Free Press. He's a wonderful human being, and he's part Jew and part Native. And here we are to talk about it. Morris, thanks for joining me.
Oh, you're very welcome, Avrum. I've been in very distinguished company. I've seen some of the guests you've had, and I'm very privileged to be included. And some people call me because of my mixed heritage. I've been known as Anishkazi Anishinabek.
I love that. Let me ask you a question. When I am reading your intro, and when you speak, you just spoke at U of T in Scarborough this week. When they read out, parts of your resume, what's going through your head as they read it?
Well, I like to keep mine really short, and that's part of the indigenous influence on me. Is that one of our teachings is humility, and it's constantly stressed. What we do is not who we are, and I go to events. Actually, the person who is my host, who works for the university, she was embarrassed because her resume went on and on and on and on, and that's just not. I'm not comfortable with that. I like people to know that I guess I have some credentials, but not to dwell on it. And when I hear what I've done, when I've been in the business world or in the political world, when you do your annual report at the end of the year, you're kind of amazed at all the things you've done.
Yes,
kind of like a review. So it's rewarding, I think.
If tomorrow, God forbid, was your last day on this planet, would you say that you've had a successful and a very purposeful life?
I have. I believe that we only start to die when we stop learning.
Yeah.
And I'm a lifelong learner, and to me, that's my definition of a bad day: is the day that I can't say that I learned something different. And I'm not one to people say, "Do you have any regrets?" I have some things that I wished I had have done and done better. But there's a cliche that if you're reasonably content with who you are, you can't really have any regrets because all of those passages in your life have led you to where you are right now.
Yeah. Yeah, something I've been thinking about all weekend, uh, and I'll put it to you maybe in trite terms, but I'm really curious about your Jewishness versus your native blood. Your father's name was Harold.
Harold.
He was a cab driver. He was a Jew. Your On your mother's side, your grandfather, he was native, and he was a chief.
Yeah.
His middle name was after an animal. We just talked about this,
Muskrat.
muskrat, which I love. So you're if you will, you're part Jewish, you're part native. When you go to shul, synagogue, are you still native? Does that still Is that still in your heart? Does it play out at all? And vice versa. When you speak in a native group, or you go to a sweat lodge, or you're up on a reserve, are you still Jewish?
Well, there's one really common thread that's very important, and that's that we're monotheists. And whatever one calls one's creator, one's God, one's higher power, one's whatever, that's similar across many beliefs. One time I was watching one of these religion channel shows on television, and they were discussing different cultures. And unfortunately, it was a rabbi who wasn't very well schooled, and he was talking about indigenous peoples, and he said, they worship animals. Well, we don't. Indigenous people don't worship animals. We happen to believe we're related to them. That's a much different, that's a real ecumenical feeling. And if everybody treated all of the creatures of the earth like all the living things like we were related to them, we wouldn't have global warming, and we wouldn't have climate change. And um, so I to me, there's one God, whatever, or G/D, whatever we want to call her or him. um, and and to me, they're just anybody that has that belief. They whatever other differences they have, whether it's in their cultural practices, the color of their skin, their days of observance, or whatever. That's the most important common thread. And the difference between indigenous spiritual beliefs is that we don't need a building. Wherever an indigenous person is, that's their church, that's their shul, that's their place of worship outdoors. Ideally, that's where nature is. That's where I believe the creator is most evident, is outdoors. um, and we can, I thought about this. I was talking to someone a couple of weeks ago about the differences between Judaism and indigenous spirituality. To my knowledge, Jews and Indians, and I'm going to use that term Indians. I'm not crazy about indigenous and aboriginal and all those terms. There is an Indian Act that still exists. Um, so Jews and Indians, when we talk to our God, our creator, we don't kneel. Most other belief systems, the adherents prostrate themselves like they're in for a whipping or something like that. We have a conversation with our creator. I think that's really interesting.
So, do you pray in your native language?
I'm not a fluent speaker. When I said earlier that there's some things I wish I had done better, one of the things, I was too young when I was brought up by my grandparents. They were both fluent speakers, and I wasn't old enough to ask them to keep speaking, because they would stop speaking when the children and grandchildren came into the room, because
Yes.
they had been led to believe in the time that wasn't going to help their children and their grandchildren. But I know some words. I can say what we call an opening. Some people call it a prayer. It's a thanksgiving in Anishinaabe, which is some people call the Ojibwe language, and I use that every day. And I wish I knew Hebrew. I've had people who said they could probably teach me workable Hebrew in a day, and someday. I'm never too old to learn, so it might happen.
Well, do you know any Yiddish?
I recognize some words, Avrum, but no.
What was Harry like, your dad?
Harold.
Harold, yeah.
I spent most of my time with my grandfather Harry on Penrith Street, as I said, just north of the Christie Pits, and he was retired. He was sort of my daycare. Both my parents worked, and he was a wonderful man. My mother thinks that I got my love of opera from him because he used to have opera music playing in the house all the time, and he had been a presser in the garment district on Spadina.
Hmm.
And he was very active, apparently, in the union movement, to the extent that I'm told that there were meetings at my house with Tim Buck, that's about as left as you could go on the spectrum in Canada at the time. And I'm sure I inherited that mindset. I was in the corporate world, and which you kind of are forced to be sort of right of the spectrum. But I'm glad that I drifted back. Um, and he was just I have very fond memories of him. My dad was he was out a lot because of his job. He had fares even to New York State and whatnot. Um, he was I remember him. I went for the last couple of times I saw him, and uh, I hadn't seen him very much because my mom and I left, but I got to meet him, and his favorite haunt in Toronto was the Fran's restaurant in um, on College there. And when I
Yes.
go to Toronto, regularly, I always try to go to Fran's.
What do you order there?
Well, if they have, and of course the ownership is much different, but if they have, any kind of smoked meat, then I'll have it. Um, when I went to Switzer's Deli, which was a cousin of mine, one of the last Jewish businesses on Spadina, my one of my I think he was a second cousin, Eddie. The big favorite was baby beef. And I don't know whether you can get baby beef anymore. It's sort of
I
like the
think,
veal of smoked meat
yeah,
sandwiches.
I think you can. I think you
Yeah,
can. Your
that was my
mom,
favorite. Yeah.
your mom was Mary. What was
No,
she?
no, my mom was Ruby.
So I'm sorry. Your mother was Ruby. What was Ruby like, Morris?
Just single moms are very special, and they that's where you really, I guess, know how much you're cared for. And she passed away just 5 days before her 101st birthday, just as COVID was starting. She was in a retirement home in Peterborough, and I spent a lot of time because I grew up in that area. But I spent a lot of time. I was fortunate to have time to visit her and spend time with her, um, and she was. I remember some of the things we talked about. In her latter months, and she didn't have any belief in any special religion. I remember her saying to me, we just have to be kind to other people. It's almost kind of like the golden rule philosophy. But she was a very modest person, she almost lowered her eyes when she spoke to people. She was very, very modest. And she was the youngest of 13 children that survived childbirth. And she was the last one to pass. Um, and her mother, when her mother had her, my grandmother Nellie, was about 43 years old, 44 years old. And, but she always spoke well of Harold. She never, she said that if it wasn't for the his gambling habit, that she would have been very content to stay there. It was very different for her. She came from a very rural kind of background, and went to Toronto to for work and with a cousin, and very different. Must have been a very difficult adjustment, for her to go into that pace of life.
So when your mother was older, when she was getting sicker, would you sit at her bedside and have intellectuals discussions? Did she have that wherewithal?
Yes, her favorite, when I used to visit her regularly at the retirement home in Peterborough, her favorite activity was she wanted me to play bingo with her, and
Yeah.
so I played bingo with the scene. I was the only I never remember all the times I did that, any other family member of any of the residents but me playing bingo. And it was very embarrassing if I won. We were playing for quarters, and if I won, I would have to make some joke like, "Oh, I really need this money to pay for gas to get back to North Bay." Or something.
Yeah. I love bingo. It's a great game.
But we played Scrabble, and she had her mental faculties really well right up until about 3 or 4 months before she passed. And the last time we played Scrabble was the Christmas of 2019, and she beat me. And half an hour later, she couldn't remember that we even played.
Really. Yeah.
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 But she was just the kindest soul, and yeah, I was very, very lucky, very lucky.
Did you have a bar mitzvah?
Yes, I did. And now that's interesting. I don't know whether I had the ceremony, but I do know I had the medical.
Oh, the bris. That would be a few years earlier on. Yeah. Yeah. You
No, I
remember?
did. I didn't have the. No, I didn't have the 13-year-old ceremony. No.
So, Morris, by the way, I find you a very handsome man, and that's why I want to see more of you. So, if you could just center yourself a bit more,
Okay.
yeah, that would be helpful. More so having this Jewish, thank you for doing that. Having this Jewish side and this native side. Tell me how you grew. Tell me how the evolution of your spirit blossomed. Where did it go?
Well, like so many people, I grew up without really being as conscious as some people are of their culture. And I didn't grow up on a reserve, so I didn't grow up in that milieu. My grandparents had become Christian, as many Indigenous peoples did. Um, and I've asked scholars about why they think that happened, and like fully 2/3 of First Nations people in Canada today, according to the census, say they're Christians. And one of the reasons that I was told that likely came about was that there were such really dramatic changes in societies who became considerably weaker once colonization started to kick in, and diseases against which they had had no immunity, and impoverishment, forced impoverishment. And as many people do today, when they think that their current belief system isn't working, they'll look for something different. So, um, so in any event, uh, it wasn't until, and you mentioned Mary, that was my late wife, Mary Pavlik was her
Yes.
maiden name, from a Slovak family in the West End of Toronto, and um, we spent over 35 years together before she passed here in North Bay in 2009.
I'm sorry.
Um, and Mary really helped me. Again, I had gone into I started in the newspaper business. I had got into the capitalist stream. I was an executive, and um, and my culture wasn't really foremost in my mind. But Mary had always kept very close to her Slovak upbringing, and she knew her language, and I saw how much her culture meant to her, and that helped me. And all of a sudden, I found myself starting to be more aware of my backgrounds, and be more. And Mary was a big help in that regard, and I began to realize, particularly when I left the newspaper business, I was still a fairly young man, um, and I decided I didn't want to spend the rest of my life making somebody else rich, and and I had it in my head as I had started to really. I guess to put it bluntly, I guess I could say I could have devoted more time to helping either my Jewish community or my Indigenous community, and frankly, the Indigenous community needed my help more.
Mhm.
And so I started the first real job I had after I left the newspaper business was working east of Belleville at a post-secondary institute called the First Nations Technical Institute. There are 8 in Ontario. There are 8 Indigenous operated post-secondary institutions, and that was one of them near Belleville. And that was a really good experience for me, not just for the work I did. I was developing the first Indigenous diploma post-secondary journalism program in Canada. And because Indigenous peoples didn't have any, this is before social media, they didn't have any real voice. And the mainstream media were just horribly racist and lack of knowledge, and it was just horrible the way Indigenous peoples were depicted in the media. So I said, well, we need our own journalists. And so that was, and in that environment, I started to learn about my culture. And I had some really influential people who had a great impact on me, and that was again, I credit my wife Mary for really instilling that importance of culture in me. And again, I wasn't in Toronto. My grandfather and dad were very secular. Harry had come to Canada about 1910 from what was then Imperial Russia. I think it's Poland now.
To escape the pogroms, right?
Pogroms, yeah. And I'm told, I have family in Toronto. Unfortunately, I don't get to see them regularly. We're all tied up in our present existence. But they told me that my grandfather, it was regarded in their family as almost, a saint, if you can have a Jewish saint, because he apparently made it possible for a lot of people. He sponsored a lot of people to come to Canada at a very critical time. So.
You seem to have really ensconced yourself in your native history, your native study, trying to understand the culture. You talked before about the relationship of the native with animals, which I find fascinating. Have you spent any time learning about Judaism or about your Jewishness as well?
I have, probably not as much. If the community up here in North Bay was more substantial, I think that would be the case. A friend of mine actually just loaned me a book we had a little gathering at the little shul. The shul here, by the way, is going to celebrate its 100th anniversary next year in North Bay.
Muzzle tough.
Yeah, and this is fascinating, by the way, as an aside. At one time, that it was a stable, which I find fascinating from a Judeo-Christian view.
Yeah, something works there, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the smell of history. Yeah.
So, but she's new. She moved here from Toronto, and the good sign is that we're starting to have people. It may be because of things like housing prices, unfortunately, but we're starting to see newer faces move into the Jewish community, which is nice. And this lady gave me a book, and it's a list of sort of all the things you wanted to know about Judaism, like customs and whatnot. And I've started looking at that to refresh my memory. But no, I don't purport to know as much as I'd like. But like I say, I'm a continuous learner.
Yeah, to say the least. So Morris, so when October 7th happened in Israel, what was your response?
Well, I was shocked, angered, hurt. But Avrum, what really disturbed me and was the immediate social media response, some of whom by people who I knew, some of whom were Indigenous people, whose immediate response was free Palestine. Like, listen, nobody, I heard your introduction. I listened to it very carefully. Nobody wants pain in this world. Nobody wants innocent people to die, children, no matter what culture they are. But after an act like that, some of the immediate response I saw online was, I was appalled. I didn't think that, I didn't think I knew people that thought that way. Now, you can chalk a lot of it up to just ignorance about the world in general and the Mideast in particular. But that's really appalling to me, and it still bothers me when this business, this river to the sea business, like, um, I'm a journalist. I still am a journalist, and when I see these interviews, I saw some yesterday with students, on University of Toronto campus, I guess. And as a journalist, I think it's your duty, if you're interviewing someone who is blabbering on about, about free this and free that, and I think it's a journalist's duty to say, do you think that the state of Israel has a right to exist?
Mhm.
I think, and if they say no, then I don't think they deserve airtime, frankly,
Mhm.
because that's genocide. You can talk about genocide all you want, but if you're talking about the river to the sea, that's genocide. And I don't know whether a lot of people are intelligent enough to understand that when they use those words, that's very unhealthy. It's very unhealthy. But that was my initial reaction, and it still is very shocking, for me.
I've seen many, many videos and many pictures and heard a lot of stories since October 7th. And I've concentrated a lot through my podcast, interviewing Israelis of all backgrounds, most of whom have had some involvement, interaction in the army or fighting in Gaza. I remember seeing a picture, I believe it was Canadian, of an Aboriginal group who were holding up signs in support of Israel and the Jewish people. And I can't tell you, Morris, and as a fellow Jew, you probably feel this as well. The support that we get like that is so encouraging to us. Have you found such voices through your work within the Indigenous community?
Um, in here in North Bay, I haven't had those discussions with people. There aren't Most of the people that I'm dealing with on a daily basis here in the Indigenous community, or primarily the urban Indigenous community. They're not even really cognizant of the global issues, Um, but I know that there are indigenous peoples who have also have Jewish heritage, and I'd love to chat with them. I know everybody knows Robbie Robertson, who's since passed away. He had that heritage. There are some fairly prominent members, sisters of the Podemsky family.
The Podensky family. I've interviewed them in the past. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Lovely
I
people.
yeah, and I think I've seen an evolution in thinking there, because again, I have had this discussion over the years with people who, when and I'm trying not to be political here, but when some of these events were taking place in the Mideast, it's very easy, if you're an indigenous person, to feel that you're siding with the underdog, and I think that's been an issue that's impacted on many indigenous peoples. But indigenous peoples have, we have had our genocides here, but we have never slaughtered people in their beds, or or done an October 7th. We haven't done that. We're not separatists. We want to stay in Canada. We think this is a great country. We protected Canada from the War of 1812 now. So what happened on October 7th is absolutely antithetic to the indigenous worldview in my mind.
Have you heard any anti Aboriginal sentiment within the Jewish community, or anti Jewish community, anti Jewishness within the Native community?
Um, Other than I have not encountered, and I know you were with the HAFTA, and I know that there are Jewish groups in Toronto that have done an awful lot of really good, important work to support First Nation communities in different ways in different parts of the province. Um, and I can't say I've ever heard anybody in the Jewish community say any. Well, I'll give you one. Yes, I just thought of one. Um, and I'll try not to center that person out, but every year on the anniversary of September 6, 1995, the night that Dudley George was killed at Ipperwash, in which the subsequent judicial inquiry found that the then premier, who happens to come from North Bay, Mike Harris, um, contributed to an atmosphere that made it more likely that that tragedy would occur. And that upsets apparently an element of people in North Bay that think it's wonderful that we're lucky enough to have a premier from our community, regardless of what he does. And a member of the Jewish community, a long-standing member, uh, couldn't stand it anymore, and at a I think it was probably a Pesach dinner actually, which he wondered why I was so mean to Mike Harris, and I tried to explain to him that he was responsible, according to a judicial inquiry, in the death of an Indigenous person. And this individual said, and I still think of it. He said, "But that was only one person." Um, and I'm reminded of is the Talmud that says that he who saves one life saves the world entire. That's the one occasion in which I've ever heard that kind of comment, and it just shows more than anything just incredible ignorance on the part of in every sense of the word on the part of that individual. Um, but that's very isolated incidents. Again, when October 7th happened, there was a knee-jerk reaction by some very people who consider themselves Indigenous activists, but they're really, they're really not contributing anything positive to the world. I saw some online comments about, cheering Palestine. Again, I that's just to me very badly informed. And I had the wonderful occasion to visit Israel once in the 1990s, and among the images that stay in my mind, the first morning that Mary and I were in Jerusalem, and we went out. It was a beautiful sunny day, and I think it was in June. I think May or June, and we saw, as you see here, a group of, they might have been kindergarten children, all following a teacher, and I think they had a rope to make sure they were all tied sort of together. And they were laughing and singing, and it was a wonderful thing. And at the end of the group, about 20, 25 children, was another, I think, teacher who had a kippah on, and over his shoulder was a Uzi. And that was my first morning in Israel, and I realized during my stay there how important security is when you are surrounded by people who don't think you have a right to exist. And I wish some of the so-called critics, the armchair critics who feel so comfortable saying things about the Midi situation, I wish they could visit and talk to people and understand some of the history, because it's not just something that should be easily casually commented on from this side of the ocean.
Can you say ch? Like l'chaim? Can you say l'chaim?
L'chaim.
Oh, so your chuz are good. Okay.
Yeah.
You know what? I've been doing research into who you are, Maurice, and one of the things that I really enjoyed was your writing. You use humor a lot in your writing. Now I know that's very much of a Jewish thing, and it's very much of a Native thing. I remember going to visit Reserve up in Kenora when I was with Via Hafta, because we had the Jewish Aboriginal department going. We did some really good stuff with the Aboriginal community, marvelous stuff, and we learned so much from them too. And it was a really incredible experience. So much of it because of the humor, right? You wrote this article about being together with a bunch of different individuals from various different religious groups, and this is what you write. It was really, really sweet. It's called Hang On to Your Hat. It's World Religion Day. The toughest thing about being Jewish, I told the World Religion Gathering, is getting your hat to stay on. And sure enough, about 10 minutes later, the black and gold yarmulke, the skull cap I bought in Jerusalem, went sliding off the back of my head. A fellow panelist kindly offered me a bobby pin, an option adopted by many male synagogue congregants, but I'm stubborn about relying on any technical assistance to keep my traditional lid intact. And this is hilarious. Later on, you said, the group came together and they were all of different religions and, spoke about their ideologies and so on. There were 100 of us in the local Elks Hall of all creeds and colors, and there a fist fight to be seen. And then in brackets, you write, there was some jockeying for position around the buffet table, but nothing approaching serious warfare. I love that. That's excellent, Maurice. Good writing. Good writing.
Well, thank you. And I know you're an artist, and I'm from what I see you post. I'm very impressed with, particularly the shtetl. I really like that one that you posted. But I've had people that I have quite an interest in art, and I sketch a lot. I always have a little sketchbook with me. That's sort of my daily journaling. I do a little sketch and maybe write. The journalist in me, I guess, influences my haiku writing. I try to just write little haikus with little things that I see that influence me. The man who I actually wrote a book about him. He was a pretty accomplished Northern Ontario artist named Bruno Cavallo, who studied with, I think, 5 or 6 members of the Group of 7, in Toronto. And he taught me, when he was trying to teach me how to paint, he said, should always try to put your lightest light close to your darkest dark. Mm-hmm. And Shakespeare used to in some of it, like in Macbeth, some of the real humor was very close to the most drastic murders in the plot and everything. And that's always, I think, stayed with me, even though, like, culturally, and a lot of Indigenous people say, oh, it's wonderful to be able to have a sense of humor when you've encountered a lot of hardship, and the Jewish community as well. So that's sort of instinctive to me. I think it drives points home when you don't just, we have too much negativity in the world. So I think if we can laugh at things. I wrote the most recent piece I wrote for the Anishinaabe News, which is the Union of Ontario Indians. It was a teaching that I had from a late, he passed away last year, an elder named, Doug Williams from Curve Lake First Nation. And they had to go without because of the Williams treaties, which were misinterpreted to them and misapplied. And they literally were told they had agreed to a treaty that said that they were going to stop hunting and fishing outside of the borders of their reserve. Well, that would be like if someone said to you, I'm going to give you this agreement, and it's basically you're going to stop eating. That's basically what that treaty meant. So they had to sneak around, to feed their families. And Doug said one of their favorite times to go ice fishing in the winter, obviously, was they would have these white blankets to cover themselves. They matched the surroundings, the camouflage. And he said we would go out. The most best time to go out was Saturday night at 8:00. And someone would say, "Well, why?" And he said, "Well, because we knew all the game wardens were watching Hockey Night in Canada."
Yeah.
So, yeah. I mean, that's very funny, but it's also very sad if you know the instance, what that refers to. So, yeah, it helps make points.
Is there a joke that you constantly remember and repeat?
Yes.
Let's hear it.
I told it at Toronto. A lot of people aren't sure how to take it. And it was a man, he was a friend of mine in Sudbury. He was one of the leaders of the Jewish community, Mitchell Spiegel, in Sudbury. He passed on a year ago. I think they just had his year's remembrance. Anyways, Mitch said, if you go to a meeting and people are getting all enthused about their strategic plan or something, or they'll always talk about commitment. This is our commitment. Like, I've served on a number of boards, and they're always talking about we got to be committed to this. And Mitch said, "Okay, you want to talk about that? are you sure you're talking that you're committed, or are you involved? And if you want to know the difference, you're supposed to think about a breakfast of bacon and eggs, and a chicken was involved, but a pig was committed. So always,
That's good. I like that. Yeshakoach. Good one. Maurice Switzer is my guest today. He's a very prolific activist and leader in Canada, amongst the Native people in particular. The question that everybody wants answered, Maurice, you kind of touched on it before. Aboriginal, Native, First Nations, Indian, what is it?
well, terminology is it's very daunting, and it makes a lot of people, including a lot of teachers, very nervous because it keeps changing.
Yeah.
And I was in the first class at Trent University. I was the first Indigenous person at that university. I didn't graduate. I left to go into the newspaper business in my middle of my second year, but I was the first Indigenous student. And they started, after I left, they started a program. It was the first of its kind in Canada, one of the first in the world, maybe the first. And they called it Indian and Eskimo Studies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That later became Native Studies. It later became Aboriginal Studies. And now it's Indigenous Studies. And it'll probably change again.
Mm-hmm.
And all that Canadians need to know is we have an Indian Act. And our Constitution refers to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Those three groups of people together, about 1.6 million of us, the majority of them are First Nations people, what used to be called Indians. We comprise about 5% of Canada's population. And this applies, I tell people they were concerned about terminology. The correct way to refer to any people in the world is to call them what they call themselves in their own language, And sometimes there are more syllables than people are comfortable with handling, but you know, so I said that I kind of said jokingly, that I've been referred to as well, Anishinaabe or Ashkenazi, Anishinaabe. But that's the most polite thing to do. And I think the only reason we use words like Indigenous and Aboriginal is it fits easier on the business card of the Minister of Indian Affairs in Ottawa.
Well, what then do natives or Indians call themselves?
Well, if you ask people from the closest First Nation to me here is Nipissing First Nation, and they call themselves Anishinaabek. There are, again, terminology makes it very confusing. There are 634 communities in Canada, including mine, Alderville, including Nipissing. They call themselves First Nation, but they are really parts of nations. Like, for example, when I worked for the Union of Ontario Indians, we were the political organization representing the Anishinaabek Nation communities in Ontario. And that's about 40 of those little communities that still call themselves First Nations.
Mm-hmm.
The reason they use the word nation is because they agreed to treaties, and only nations agree to treaties. It's one of the things that separates Indigenous peoples in this country and the United States from many Indigenous peoples around the world, and is that we had treaties, and that gives us some rights that other Canadians don't have, and Canadians get very upset if those rights are exercised. For example, the Mi'kmaq lobster fishers, they have a treaty that was upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada, and when they exercised their treaty right to harvest lobster, they had their boats burned and they were assaulted, and that's because Canadians, for most of this country's history, didn't learn about things like treaties because it was excluded from school curricula.
Yeah, you showed a map
Yeah.
in a course that you were giving, was on Zoom, and you showed all of the various different treaties across Canada, and there were 13 or 14, and basically the whole nation, Canada, was covered with the treaty color that you put in.
Hmm.
And what's interesting is, and I'm going to ask you to give a micro lesson on what treaties are, because I'm telling you, I mean, you just said it.
Yeah.
Most people, the vast majority, have no idea what a treaty is, how it's played out, what the legal responsibilities are. And I want you to give a Cole's notes of a Cole's note.
Um, well, as I said at the University of Toronto this week, I have a simple task, and that's to explain 400 years of history in an hour.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Lots of
but
luck. Yeah, now you got a couple of minutes. So yeah.
I always preface whatever I say by saying, I hope what you hear me say, whether you agree with it or not, I hope it makes you want to learn more. So,
And read your
treaties,
book. And read your
yeah.
book.
Oh, I have to remind me, I have a plug. I have a new book coming out. Might be my only novel. It's going to be out later this year. Anyway,
Beautiful. Plug away.
I will. When the newcomers came here, first the French in big numbers, actually the Dutch in parts of what's now the United States, they were terrified of the indigenous peoples. They were just absolutely terrified. So the first thing they did is they wanted to make friends. Let's be friends. And they knew enough from their European culture that treaties were a type of diplomacy. Indigenous peoples had their own types of agreements, treaties between themselves. So it wasn't totally foreign to them. So they started with these agreements that started off being peace and friendship agreements. And later, as Europeans became more populous in this country, um, and they never really told the Indians, hey, we're here to conquer you and we're going to take your land from you. But that was always the underlying assumption, and it still is. But they thought that it made them very nervous because when the British sort of gained um, colonial authority over the French in the 7 Years' War that ended in the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, um, the Indians really were not happy because they had a very good relationship with the French. They were very fair traders. They intermarried freely with them, and the English were much more aloof, and they didn't like the custom of giving what they called presents. The Europeans called them presents. It was actually rent, for the privilege of being on in native land. And that's when the famous General Jeffrey Amherst, who called the Indians in his dispatches execrable people. Execrable comes from the same root word as excrement, and he authorized some of his henchmen to infect in blankets with smallpox to distribute among the Indians. Well, they shipped him off home very quickly because the powers that be in Britain realized they had to try diplomacy, because one great leader named Pontiac, his name was Obundia, after the British beat the French, he to show his displeasure, he captured with a couple of hundred warriors 9 of 12 British forts. That convinced the British that they better not try military the way they had in many other places around the world. They felt that wasn't going to work here. So they started this treaty process. And the first big treaty was the Treaty of Niagara in the summer of 1764. And that the promises that were made there, Sir William Johnson, on behalf of the mightiest European empire in history, said, if you agree to share your land with us, your people will never be poor as long as the world exists. And he gave thousands of gifts. He wrote all this down. He had clerks write all this down. And that was really the beginning of the treaty process. But everything was fine as long as the Indians outnumbered the Europeans. As soon as the War of 1812 is over, in which the Indians were the Canada's defense force, as soon as massive immigration started coming in the 1850s and 60s, just before Confederation, all of a sudden everybody forgot about the promises, and the treaties became a very cynical attempt just to get the Indians off their land, so that Johnny MacDonald could build his railway. They were giving away land that they'd never had title to. It was amazing how quickly that happened. And again, the Indians were decimated by disease, and they'd suffered great casualties, and entire communities were wiped out by things like smallpox. And So that, and that's the treaty process began, and in many cases there was no negotiation. It was just, this is what it is. And the thing that I point out when I talk to students is I never use the term Indian signed treaties because they couldn't read or write English. They relied on what the translators told them, and in many cases the translators just outright lied. And I know I'm more than 2 minutes, but in a nutshell, that's what's happening right up to the present day. And the courts are really making almost all decisions, tend to be in the last 20 or 30 years or 40 years in favor of Indigenous peoples who have sued Canada, because the rule of law says you made promises, they're recorded. Some people are very upset because treaty promises have all been broken. And my argument is it's far better from a legal perspective to have a broken promise on record than never having had a promise at all. So again, the most close to me here, the Robinson-Huron Treaty, that dates back to 1850, pre-Confederation. 21 First Nations, they were given an annuity for agreeing to share their land. And they were given, starting in 1874, $4 a year. Well, guess what the annuity is today, 170 years later? It's $4. So they've won that court case that annuity has to be increased. And but the courts are ahead of the politicians in recognizing those rights. So that's about as much as I can condense treaties.
No, nice job. How many treaties are there?
In Ontario, 46.
And throughout Canada?
About 70. There's not 1 square centimeter of Ontario land that isn't under treaty. Indigenous peoples have never been conquered in battle by Europeans, not in this country. Our parliament buildings sit on Algonquin land that has never been paid for. Not 1 penny of rent has ever been paid to the Algonquin people for the land that's right underneath our parliament buildings. And
Maurice, when I go to an event nowadays, which is construed as being progressive, very often, and you hear this at hockey games as well, very often they will begin that we are on the land of the Mississauga, whatever, right? And they will mention the people who originally had that land. And I'm started to think, and I wonder what your take is on this. Why are you telling me, the Aboriginal, that you're on my land? Get off it. What do I get out of you making such an announcement?
There's a great, I refer people when we talk about land acknowledgements, the Baroness von Sketch CBC program. If you want to see something that's really good, it's on YouTube, and it's a spoof on land acknowledgements. And the best land acknowledgement in 10 cents won't even buy you a piece of licorice, I don't think, anymore.
It definitely won't buy you licorice. No, no, definitely not. No.
But it's important. It's a start. Symbolism is a start.
Okay.
And like, we're fighting here with City Council to fly an Indigenous flag in the big park not far from where I live. There's an Italian flag because the former mayor Vic Fedeli was Italian. There's a Franco-Ontarian flag. There's an Air Force flag. There's a Canadian flag. There's an English flag. But we can't get them to fly an Anishinaabeg flag. The people who were here first. So those things are symbolic, but they're important. But most Canadians are all in favor of what we call reconciliation, as long as there isn't a price tag attached. And but I'll give you a real example of reconciliation, Avrum. When I was at the University of Toronto this week, I thanked my hosts because, yes, they have a land acknowledgement, but they announced at the start of this last year that going forward, every student from the 9 First Nations on whose traditional lands their campuses sit will no longer have to pay tuition. Wow. That's reconciliation. Wow. Now, they have the luxury of the economy of size that they can do that. Many smaller institutions, but in any event, they deserve credit for doing that. That's reconciliation, because education was promised us as a treaty right. Many people think that all Native kids get free education. Well, they don't. They're huge.
Paul Martin did some great work on education within the Aboriginal community. I think for free, much of it.
Well, um,
Am I
a
going
lot of
somewhere I shouldn't go?
well, a lot of people, a lot of politicians like to use indigenous contributions as part of their legacy, and he had all sorts of opportunities when he was in office that he didn't pursue.
Yeah, but I got a sense that when he was out of office, he felt he could do more.
Yeah, well, yes,
Okay, we'll leave that.
I agree with you. I will agree that he's done more since he's been out of office than he did when he was in. We'll
Absolutely.
absolutely agree.
I think Paul, former prime minister, he's one of the better guys. You know, I've interviewed him and I think he is. But that being said, you know more than I do. Um, the residential schools, they were existed from 1800 to the late 1900s. They were government funded, mainly church run. 150,000 Indigenous children attended these schools, age 4 to 16. And the purpose of these schools was to assimilate Indigenous children to Christian European ways. Well, here's the kicker, okay? 1 in 25 children died in these schools, these Canadian schools, government and church run, due to poor conditions, not enough nutrition provided, and attempts to escape the schools. The last residential school closed in 1996. Maurice Switzer, often when I bring up discussions about the Native community, the Indian community here in Canada, eyes roll. It's like, we have a government led by Sir John A. Macdonald who decided that it was a good idea to go into Native environments and scoop children out of their mother's arms and take them 1,000 miles away and educate them through nuns and priests about how to be a good Christian. How did that happen in Canada?
It happened, a few minutes ago. I was talking about how the British were more aloof, and when I talk to students, as I did this week, and faculty members, I start with a slide of the so-called Fathers of Confederation, 37 white men,
Yeah.
And I ask the audience. I say, "Is that what Canada looked like in 1867? Were there no women in Canada? Like, how come women couldn't even vote for this wonderful new country for about 60 years after it started?"
Yeah.
Um, and so there was I don't want to disparage Europeans. I'm part European myself, but there were mindsets, and I don't say they've completely disappeared, that that anybody who is from other than European ancestry is somehow inferior. And I wish more Canadians knew about the doctrine of discovery, which has been around for 500 years, and it's never been removed from the books, and it underpins colonialism, including this country. And it basically said from the predominant Christian church, that if explorers go anywhere in the world and they come to lands where the people don't believe what we believe, we're entitled to take their land and to subjugate their people. That's the underpinning of colonialism, the most racist international doctrine probably ever brought into being. And so that idea that somehow they had to make Indigenous people into change their belief system, outlaw their customs and habits. People went to jail for singing traditional songs and for their dances. They went to jail. Indians weren't allowed to hire lawyers to pursue land claims under the Indian Act. I mean, these are things most Canadians aren't aware of. That these are things we think happened in a banana republic somewhere in South America. That was part and parcel of how Canada began. And I don't talk much about residential schools, Avrum, because I'm not a survivor, and any more than I would talk much about the Holocaust, certainly without a survivor. And I tell school teachers, if you're going to talk about in your class residential schools, there are 85,000 survivors out there everywhere. Very few families don't have a residential school survivor. My grandfather went to what was politely called a training school, a day school, which was part of the residential school system in near Alderville. And he went and ran away when he was 8 years old. If he hadn't, I wouldn't be here. And um, he had to teach himself how to read and write, and never talked about his experience with the family. Um, and this is a national, it's a national crime, and there was no mention of it in this country's school curricula for most of this country's history. And in my way of thinking, for any Canadian student, I don't think any Canadian student should be allowed to graduate without knowing their country's true history, any more than a student in Germany should be allowed to graduate without any knowledge of the Holocaust. And so the most amazing thing about residential schools is because of all the damage that was caused, and it's intergenerational damage, lack of parenting skills, lack of, of so many, things that most humans take for granted. The damage that was done. The amazing thing is that the resilience that Indigenous peoples have shown, from that experience. And many, I tell teachers, make sure your students understand about some of these things like residential schools, but talk about the contributions that Indigenous peoples make. There have been 2 Native American astronauts. um, some of the greatest artists and hockey players and singers, and we have doctors and lawyers, and even in a community like North Bay, we have doctors and lawyers. um, there was a family in Dokis First Nation near here, and at one time they had a doctor, a lawyer, an Indian chief, all in one family. They're all women. I think there's an old nursery rhyme: doctor, lawyer, Indian.
Yeah, something
um,
like that.
yeah,
Or your next book. Yeah.
yeah. So I want Canadians to know. I don't want anybody to feel sorry for me. I don't want anybody to treat me like a victim. But I want them to understand that these things happened. And I know that I don't know of any Indigenous peoples that lean on that play that as a card. But people have to understand that the impact that has had. And you mentioned the 1 in 25. If one child in the city of North Bay doesn't come home from school tonight, every cop, every Mountie, every OPP, there'll be a massive, ground search. Um, and that statistic about kids that went to residential school just so far, and they haven't uncovered all the possible deaths so far. Statistically, it was more dangerous to be a student in an Indian residential school than it was to be a Canadian soldier in World War II. That's a terrifying statistic. And Canadians need to understand that. Instead of being defensive and saying, "Oh, that's in the past, let's forget about that." Um, you know, you've heard all these cliches. If we, those who ignore the past are condemned to relive it. We're seeing that now with the anti-Semitism that's bubbled up, again around the world. I was listening to CBC this morning, and they're talking about, again, in Germany of all places, some really flagrant anti-Semitic, gatherings, and I guess the German equivalent of the Proud Boys. So.
Morris, touching on that, I mean, we all know that the Jews are hated by many. And there have been vile comments coming out since October 7th and afterwards. We all know that the Native community, there's an awful lot of racism directed toward that community. I see it. I've seen it through my work with the Native community and the Jewish community. Why do people hate like that? Where does that hate come from?
Um, you know, um, I think there are many unfortunate human characteristics. And I think one of them is we always like to think that someone is worse than we are.
Yeah.
And that's why programs like, what were some of those programs where they used to have fistfights on stage,
Oh,
um,
yes. I don't remember
that's why they had such high ratings, because people, you could be pretty low on society's, in
Oh,
society's.
Jerry Springer. Jerry
Jerry
Springer.
Springer,
Yeah, yeah.
and yet you could always feel that you're better than those people that you see on TV. And I really think that instead of being grateful for whatever we have in life, and even our poorest in this country are privileged in many ways to what people are in other parts of the world. We've only ever had one war on this country's soil, and that was the War of 1812, and Indians took the biggest brunt of that. And we don't know what it's like, to live when you go to Europe and if you visit just about any country in Europe, and they've had nothing but wars on their soil for the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 900 years. So we're very, very comparatively privileged, I think, and I think it's very easy for people too easy for people who are affluent to feel that other people are beneath them. And I like very much your introduction, which sounded very optimistic. I saw something new on Facebook this morning, and it was a saying. They didn't attribute it to anybody. It sounds almost Buddhist or something. And it said, there's all kinds of water. The earth is 70% water, but it can't sink a ship unless the water gets inside it.
Mm-hmm.
And it said that's the same with negativity. If we keep it outside of us, we won't get sunk.
Nice.
And I think too many of us allow that to creep in, that it can be envy. Like when I go to the only time I run into what I would come close to that racism, if I go to Walmart or Costco and I can get 8 cents off on the dollar because of a treaty right, showing that little status card, I hear rumblings behind me, and these are people. I mean, my goodness, if you want to trade places with Indigenous peoples, because you see them get 8 cents off the dollar in Walmart, boy, you wouldn't survive on most reserves that I have seen. I'll tell you.
Do you ever turn around to those people?
Yeah. If it's obvious, and actually, it has happened with clerks. I actually filed a human rights complaint against a clerk in a well-known store. I'm not allowed to name the store because that was the condition of the settlement. A store not far from me, and that's one of the most common things is for people to. It's that resentment. Well,
what did the clerk say to you?
They were just. I've had people throw the card back at me, like literally throw it back at me. Or a lot of it is just humph or harumphing, or or you should have shown me that earlier, or I've had clerks say, "Oh, it must be nice," it's out there, and again, I'm lucky because I have a fairly privileged position that I don't think in a small community that I would encounter some of the things that many other people do. But I have.
I'll tell you an interesting insight on anti-Semitism. I've been talking to my family and friends about this. I'll often go on social media and I'll put out statements that are pro-Israel, that are pro-Zionist, of which I am both. And the responses are vile, just absolutely vile.
Yeah.
And very often attached to those vile comments is, "You Jewish people, shut up. You have nothing to complain about." And when I ask them to tell me further, they say, "You're the richest people in the world. You have, look how many Nobel Peace Prizes and other prizes that you win. Your families are intact. You in the Holocaust, you've made it into a business. There's a lot of this. You guys have nothing to complain about." And I said to my friends and family, very often the anti-Semite does not allow the Jew to suffer. They don't want them to suffer. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, and one of the common things that you will hear directly or indirectly about residential schools is people will say, "Oh, just get over it."
Yeah, get over it. Yeah,
get over it.
Pull up your socks.
Yeah, pull up your socks. And there was a great movie, and this is why arts are so important. We have to find ways other than in classroom settings or in lectures, because the people who should hear these things don't go to those, you know. Um,
That's true.
but in popular, for example, there was a, did you see the movie Spotlight about won an Academy Award? It was an artistic success and a box office failure. Nobody ever remembers anything about it. Um, and it was about the abuse of boys in the Catholic Church in Boston. It's a true
I
story.
saw it. I saw it. Yeah.
And when people see movies like that and understand what they're saying, it should help them get some insight into residential schools, because I think most people, unless they can feel suffering that other people feel in you know, in a way that it's relevant to them, I don't think they're capable of maybe of empathizing. And I've it's funny, I've heard someone say that Jews are criticized for what they do and for what they don't do, like for, you know, for being victims or for being perpetrators.
Yeah. There's a lot of that. Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
no happy medium at all. And but a lot of that is just envy, you know. I really believe. And yeah, it's great that haven't you know, Jewish people, you know, won a lot of Nobel prizes, and who have been the beneficiaries of all of those, of that learning and all of that studies, not just Jews. um, you know, charities, you know, tend to be the biggest givers. um, but a lot of that is just, I think, is just envy. And there's a lot of that in our society. There's not a lot of values, I don't think, you know. So I want to plug my book. I want to plug my book.
Yeah. So before you plug your book, I want to plug something here. You know, via Hafta, the organization that I founded and directed for about 20 years, we had a Jewish First Nations department, and we did a lot of programming together with the Aboriginal community. Really beautiful, beautiful stuff. We went into Jewish schools and we taught teachers about how to teach about the residential schools and the Native communities. It was very successful. We were also at the Truth and Reconciliation wrap up, which was in Ottawa. And together with other Jewish organizations, we signed a document stating our affinity, our commitment to the outcome of the Truth and Reconciliation process, of which I think there were 99 or so recommendations. In the document that we wrote, Bernie Farber, a very high profile guy in the Jewish community and outside of it as well, and he was the chairman of Yahavt at that time, chairperson. He wrote, First Nations and Jews share a common bond. Both have a strong sense of community and honor of our elders and teachers. We also share the experience of having faced trauma and discrimination. While we have traveled separate but parallel roads, we understand the need to stand in solidarity as we face the truth of Canada's treatment of First Nations people. And I thought that was very prolific and compelling.
Well, I know Bernie, and I actually have been on agendas with him at schools. I've known Bernie for many years, and what you just said reminded me when I was in Ottawa. I was on twice on the radio broadcast of Rabbi Reuben Bolka.
Rabbi Bolka.
May he rest in peace.
Rest
What
in
a
peace.
wonderful man he
Yes,
was.
he was. Yes, he was.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um,
Let's hear a plug for your book. It's nice. Very nice. Beautiful.
um, my first and probably only novel. It's kind of the culmination, I think, of life's work, and it's really um, it's self-published, and I anticipated that would likely be the case because um, in this era of the pendulum is still swinging in the direction that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission wanted it to swing, but it's on the verge of swinging a bit too far. And people are afraid to say anything that is a justifiable criticism about Indigenous politics. And I feel that I'm going to take this opportunity to do
Wow.
that. Um, and there's some history in it about the great leader Tecumseh, who wanted to unite indigenous peoples on the continent against the forces of colonization. And that, and running parallel to that is a story about how contemporary First Nation leaders are not having really any more success than Tecumseh had in doing that. And so I think there's some themes there that should resonate with Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples alike. I think it's a story that needs to be told. And
Where's it
so
available?
well, it's coming out in August, and I'm not sure of all the distribution yet, but you'll be hearing more. We'll be hearing more about it.
We're sure it'll be on Amazon for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, that's exciting, Maurice. Way to go! I'm happy for you. You wrote a kid's book as well, didn't you?
Well, I've written a book about the artist. I mentioned to you Bruno Cavallo when I was in Sudbury. It was the first book that had ever been written about him, and we used it as a catalog for a show of his. And I've written 3 books on treaties, including one, Grandpa, What is a Treaty Anyway? I've written that for the local school board. My one book, it's a graphic novel, We Are All Treaty People. I'm told it's regarded as a Canadian bestseller with only about 15 or 16,000 copies sold. But this one is a novel. I've written thousands of articles and columns and over the years, but yeah, I'm
Way to go.
lucky.
Maurice Switzer has been my guest today, an activist within the Native community, half Native, half Jewish. I found the conversation fascinating, and I always enjoy my time with him. And mostly what I'd like to say at the conclusion of the show is if you're really, really struggling on trying to figure out where your zone lies, where your motivation lies for life, look really deeply, listen to this conversation, because here's a man who has developed himself so much over the years, despite much hardship, despite many, many challenges. He has stepped up, and he is an author, he's a writer, he's a journalist, an activist, and he is just a fine human being. So, Maurice, thank you so much for inspiring us. I really, really appreciate that. I think you did a beautiful job, and I wish you well. I wish you well.
Thank you, Avrum. I really appreciate it.
And we want to conclude at the top of the show. You said that while you're not proficient in the Ojibwe language, I believe it is, but you do know a prayer. Can you end the show with that prayer?
Sure. It's a Thanksgiving, and it'll be our the Anishinaabe way, and most Indigenous ways, is to introduce ourselves when we're talking to the Creator. I'll do that and give my clans: Muskrat Clan, Wolf Clan. My great grandmother was Mohawk, Ganyegahaga. And then the Thanksgiving I give will be, I'm taught that my first gift today, it was when I opened my eyes. Everything after that was a bonus as well. So we have to remember, again, understanding that we have so many things to be grateful for. We all have problems. We all have challenges. But we have many, many things to be grateful for. And everything from the air that we breathe, the water we drink, the animals, all the other creatures that without which we couldn't. Just think, if there were no bees, we'd probably all be dead.
Yeah.
Little bees. So that's what I'll do, and I'm glad to. Ani bojo benezi dishnakas wajash dodo michi sagi ganashnabak aguaho ganyegahaga hodna shoni michi sagi. Alderville Donjiba, North Bay and Diane, and Ashnabak and Dow. Miigwech, Misham Sanonik, Miigwech, Nakomas Nonik, Miigwech, Mazukwe, Gimijang Shkiki, Gimijang Tikog, Gimijang Wasiniag, Gimijang Benesiag, Gimijang Gagonia, Gimijang Sanin, Gimijang Aki, Gimijang Nodin, Gimijang Shkoda, Gimijang Nabi, Gimijang Mijaminwa, Gimijang Madzawin, Samanagap Kidnanan Gawednang, Wabnang, Jaunang, Minagabiaunang, Miigwech, 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 Miigwech.
Hey, I think you can take Ojibwe online.
Yeah, oh yeah.
I challenge you to do it. I challenge you. And then to learn Hebrew. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening and for watching. We look forward to being with you again. Until then, Zygazin, go in peace, and miigwech. Thank you, Maurice.